The Ear to Asia podcast is made available on the Jakarta Post platform under agreement between the Jakarta Post and the University of Melbourne.
Hello, I'm Sami Shah. This is Ear to Asia.
I think whenever you get a desire for a location, whether it's to be used for mining, for some sort of extractive purposes, or for the testing of nuclear weapons, the capacities of people within those societies who have autonomous cultural systems that have been built up over thousands of years or hundreds of years is massively reduced. If you're looking at this from the viewpoint of the People's Republic of China or the United States or France, these things are just collateral damage because the populations involved are so small and they are therefore powerless.
In this episode, Rethinking Empire, Extraction, and Identity in the Pacific, a New History. Ear to Asia is the podcast from Asia Institute, the Asia Research Specialist at the University of Melbourne. For many, the history of the Pacific Ocean might conjure up the stories of isolated island societies like French Polynesia or Hawaii, or a mere backdrop to European discovery. However, what if the Pacific is actually a central maritime world, a vast network of interconnections, journeys, and struggles that began long before the advent of steamships? By shifting our gaze away from the traditional Western narratives, we may uncover the unexpected threads that draw together surprisingly diverse terrains. From the landlocked heights of Bolivia to the barren landscapes of Banaba Island in present-day Kiribati, and even to the industrial port of Haijiao in China. How did ancient networks of silver, nitrates, and phosphates fuse the destinies of tiny Pacific islands with those of massive continental powers? Why did some regions successfully escape the fate of becoming mere economic hinterlands, while others faced total ecological devastation? And in a global system defined by deep asymmetries, how might exploring these connections change what we think we know about the Pacific's past and possibly its future? To help us unravel the threads of this historical tapestry, I am joined by regular guest on the show, Asia historian Dr. Louis Mayo from Asia Institute. Welcome back to Ear to Asia, Louis.
Thanks for having me, Sami. I'm very pleased to talk to you again.
Louis, you write that the 13th century is the Big Bang moment or the origin of the modern Pacific. What do you mean by that? What was the Pacific like before the 13th century, and what's the evidence of this genesis?
Well, there's a lot of different ways of looking at the Pacific, and one of those is, of course, the viewpoint from Pacific Islanders. And the 13th century is the point at which the Pacific Islands become fully populated in their current form by humans. Essentially, migrants from eastern Polynesia reach Hawaii. They reach Rapa Nui or Easter Island on the coast of Chile, and they reach Aotearoa, New Zealand in the far south. So that's a point at which essentially the modern population structures of the Pacific Islands get their origin point. The other way of looking at the Pacific, of course, is that to see it as the zone that is between Asia in the west and the Americas in the east. And in the 13th century, essentially, you see the two what you would call core centers of power in Central America. That is the Aztecs in Mexico, and the Inca state in the Peruvian Bolivian highlands, essentially being constituted as large-scale empires. And in the East Asian zone, that's the period in which the Mongol conquests essentially bring a single political system, basically, that runs all the way from the edge of Siberia right down into Southeast Asia into existence. And so those two different ways of looking at the Pacific makes the 13th century, the 1200s, basically a point at which we can use to ground modern accounts of what the Pacific is as a system. So, from the point of view of the Americas, from the point of view of Asia, and the point of view of the Pacific Island zone itself.
Let's build a bigger picture then by taking a more detailed look at three locations, as you've detailed already. Let's start with China. What were the major changes in power structures in 13th century China? What were the impacts of these changes?
Well, when one thinks about the 13th century in China, one of the pivotal moments, I guess, is the point when the forces of the Mongol Empire destroy the last remaining power base of the Sung dynasty in southern China. That happens in the 1280s, and create a unified state whose capital is Beijing. And that's the first time, really, that Beijing becomes the center for political administration for a state that rules both the Yangtze Valley in the south and the Yellow River Valley in the north. And that, in a sense, is a set of circumstances that, with a few moments of, interregna, through that period, essentially has persisted right up until the present. So, Beijing basically being the dominant site for the organization of political power. And what that does, of course, is to unite a basically northern zone, which is a mixed zone of agriculture and pastoralism, which is found in Central Asia and Mongolia, with a southern commercial rice growing zone that extends essentially from the area slightly north of modern Shanghai down into Southeast Asia, essentially towards Vietnam, Thailand, and the island world in Indonesia and the Philippines. So those two systems kind of come together at this point in the 13th century.
So, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, there is the Americas. What's happening there?
Well, as I mentioned before, what you see if you're approaching this from the viewpoint of centralized states, you're getting large imperial structures consolidating themselves in the areas that we now think of as Mexico, Guatemala, that's adjacent to that zone. And in the south, you see in the areas around Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and down into the fringes of Chile, you see large imperial structures being consolidated in those two zones. And what that means, of course, is that you have a central capital, which is a ritual and military structure, ruling over a population that is essentially agricultural, presiding over religious and economic integration in those zones, as well as military integration, and a whole lot of peoples who are, in a sense, on the periphery of those zones, but are affected by those centralizing tendencies. So those are the two macro systems that you see coming into existence in the 13th century.
We have the Inca and the Aztec polities. How do these imperial structures provide a basis for modern Pacific states like Bolivia?
Okay, so Bolivia, of course, is no longer a Pacific state. This is a very interesting part of its history. It loses its access to the Pacific in the 19th century in a war that's fought between Chile, Peru, and Bolivia itself, the War of the Pacific. And that moves, in a sense, that Pacific zone away from Bolivian control, making Bolivia a landlocked kind of mountainous country. But essentially the pre-modern period, essentially the period prior to the conquest of that zone by the Spanish, does involve a reciprocal interaction between the coastal area and those areas essentially in the hinterland. That's what I suppose provides the basis for the imperial and then post-imperial states that appear with the Spanish conquest. And one can see a similar dynamic unfolding in the central part of the Americas, in Mexico and Guatemala and the places to the south of those zones. So you have the Spanish essentially annex imperial structures in those two central zones that then provide the basis for the states that they build between the 16th century and then that they lose in the independence wars of the early 19th century.
So, from China to the Americas, let's stay in the 13th century still, and let's continue now to the Pacific Island groups. In the Pacific Ocean, what is happening in the islands that later became known as Polynesia during this period?
So what you're seeing there is, in many cases, the expansion of or consolidation of some old power structures, most notably in the zone around Tonga, Fiji, and Samoa. Those have been populated for a long period, and you see particularly the building and consolidation of a royal state in Tonga, which, to all intents and purposes, lasts right up until the present. And then if you move eastwards from that, you're seeing an expansion from that the 13th century, in a sense, is a culmination of voyaging Polynesian peoples moving out into areas, first of all, in what's now French Polynesia, and then northward towards Hawaii, eastwards towards Rapa Nui or Easter Island on the coast of Chile, and southwards eventually towards Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in all those places, you see expanding political units that are taking possession, in a sense, of unpopulated territories, building up their power structures and their cultural systems, and that's an unfolding process that carries on right really until the changes that occur in the beginning of the 19th and in the late 18th centuries, which is when those polities are in a sense brought into a larger structure that includes the Americas on one side and the East Asian zone and Southeast Asian zone on the other, and of course the Atlantic world that is in a sense expanding both across into the Americas, but also from the south around the southern coast of Africa and then down into Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. That's the space that we're seeing in this period. So the 18th and 19th centuries are a period of transition, which in many ways change the structures that have been there prior to that point, but they also build upon what is there that been there previously and has been established over the centuries that run up to the 1760s, 1770s, 1780s to the 1800s.
I want to stay in that period a little bit longer. How do communities in Hawaii or Tahiti navigate being politically part of the settler states like the United States and France, respectively, while remaining culturally rooted in the oceanic world?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting set of questions. It's in the course of the 19th century that those states, in a sense, join this larger trans-Pacific system. Essentially, Hawaii starts earlier, 1770s, 1780s. There's an internal consolidation of power in Hawaii that leads to the establishment of the Hawaiian Kingdom. The Hawaiian Kingdom is a significant player in the internal diplomacy of the Pacific from the 1810s, 1820s through to the middle of the 19th century, but partly as a result of the expansion of commercial connections and settler power in that zone in the middle of the 19th century. You see it eventually, the Hawaiian Kingdom being overthrown by a coalition of American settler planters, and then ultimately seeing it incorporated into the United States in the years after World War II. So what you see, of course, is a steady demographic reduction of the centrality of the native Hawaiian population all through that period, such that they became a minority in their own homelands in a fashion that's very similar to the way that the people of Rapa Nui become a demographic minority in that zone, and the culturally Chilean structures that come from the American mainland become dominant there, and in the way that the indigenous Māori people of Aotearoa, New Zealand become a demographic minority in the course of the 19th century. But as we know, in all three zones, you have a process of political and cultural reassertion that has unfolded really in the last 40 to 50 years, with, when you're in Hawaii, a much stronger accent on the centrality of native Hawaiian culture to the identity of Hawaii as a space. And certainly in Aotearoa New Zealand, a much stronger assertion of the mouldiness of that society in the course of the last 4 decades or so. French Polynesia is a different case because demographically the population is not de-Austronesianized or de-Polynesianized in the way that the populations of Aotearoa New Zealand, Rapa Nui, and Hawaii are. But what you have is a steady expansion of French cultural influences across that zone. And of course, it remains politically part of the French state in the way that Rapa Nui is part of the Chilean state, that Hawaii is part of the United States, with the exception being, of course, that in the case of Rapa Nui and of Hawaii, they are part of states that they are geographically adjacent to, whereas the French state is located on the other side of the world.
So between the 13th centuries and this more modern period that you described sits the 16th century, which you've said is a pivotal period for human connections across the Pacific. What happened in this period of history then?
So, I mean, the normal account of this period, and this is something that I think historians such as myself and a number of my colleagues and peers in this field are trying to rethink. The old account is that this, of course, is the period of global European expansion, particularly by by Spanish and Portuguese voyagers, who then form a trading network that essentially spans the entire globe. And that essentially this is the beginning of the era of global European domination. But I think in Pacific terms, what matters is essentially that the Pacific coast of the Americas, the Pacific societies in the Americas centered on the states in Mexico in the north, and the Inca state in the Peru, Bolivia zone in the south. Those areas are brought into contact with East Asia through trans-Pacific voyaging, whose central node in many ways is the Philippines, which is a point of intersection between the economic and cultural zones of East and Southeast Asia and those of the Americas. And so what this does is to bring the Pacific into a kind of connection, an east-west connection, for the first time, essentially, in its history. So the voyagers from Asia, ultimately, who populate that whole island zone from the Philippines eastwards, the one that we discussed at the beginning of that group is now locked together with the, in a steadily expanding way, with the American zone and with the zone in East Asia. So if you think about it, the western side of this area, that's the Pacific countries that are adjacent to Asia. Those tend to be highly Asianized. The eastern side of this is culturally and politically Americanized. And the southern part of it, which is the zone that Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand are part of, are in a sense culturally anglicized in the course of the 19th century. But it's in the 16th century that the foundations of that system are established.
How was Haijo impacted by this?
Okay, so Haijo, this is an interesting sort of site, because I don't believe that prior to my own work on the subject, which appeared in the Cambridge History of the Pacific Oceans, which appeared about 3 or 4 years ago, that no one had, in a sense, targeted that particular spot. But I was interested in the coincidence between that linked Haijo, which is a zone in the northern part of Jiangsu province, which is one of the sites of the first phosphate mines in modern China. That is an area which I suppose is almost like a point of mediation, you could say, but also a middle point between the structure that I spoke about at the beginning, the northern zone that centers on Beijing, and then a southern zone that essentially, spreads southwards from the Yangtze Valley down into the Guangdong region. Essentially, that's a point essentially of, as I say, of contact between those two areas, and as that middle point, which of course is part of this incredibly dynamic economic zone that in a sense shapes the world economy in the present, the one that runs all along the coast of China from the border of Korea all the way down to the border of Vietnam. It's in that zone essentially that we see in the 13th century a kind of linking of that into a common system that then becomes the basis for a maritime world in East Asia that runs into Southeast Asia, so essentially runs from essentially Siberia, Japan, Taiwan, down into the Philippines, coast of Vietnam, etc. That, in a sense, is a point of juncture and conjunction between those zones. And in the modern period, as I say, with the expansion of a modern industrial system based on chemical fertilizer in particular, the presence of phosphates in that zone gives it a new importance that builds upon and transforms the status that it had essentially in the earlier period, which is where you can see the beginnings of a global modern industrial system in the territories of the Song dynasty and its successor, the Yuan. But essentially, it's when the 19th century shifts to the heavy reliance on fossil fuels and on artificial fertilizers and on modern weaponry that it acquires the identity that I've mapped for it in the study that I did that linked it to the situations of other phosphate-producing zones across the Pacific space.
So while this is taking place, we've got the Americas, we got the whole Asia side kind of reconnecting more. What's happening in the Polynesian Islands during the same period?
Well, as I've said, you're seeing a population, I mean, a relatively late a process of populating unpopulated territories, late in terms of human history, where in a sense islands that have been uninhabited prior to that point are becoming inhabited, and so cultures are being built up by people who have memories of homelands and therefore have a narrative of their presence in somewhere else before they came to that place. A good example of this is the pervasive word in Polynesian languages from which we get Hawaii, which is Hawaii, which refers to some kind of homeland that settlers have voyaged from to arrive in the islands where they are present. And that this formation of these cultures, and it's interesting that these are the last places in the world to be settled by humans prior to modern navigation. The only other significant place that is uninhabited in recent times is Mauritius, actually. So that Mauritius has no people on it prior to the expansion of European power. So these are places that, say, if you contrast them with Australia, or Papua New Guinea, settled for tens of thousands of years, these are places which have a human settlement depth that is relatively short. So, and where voyaging is central to the consolidation of those places. So, in a sense, these are societies which are all settled in similar ways, but are sufficiently far away from each other to have developed separate cultures and identities, but sufficiently connected with each other to be able to interact very successfully once the possibilities for inter-island contact are intensified when you get European-style shipping moving into that area in a significant way in the late 18th century.
Let's fast forward now to the 20th century. How is Haijiu handling the tumultuous 20th century at this point? How did Haijiu escape the fate of being a marginalized hinterland and instead becomes a driver of global economic growth?
Well, that's an interesting thing. As I say, my take on Haido is, in a sense, mine. I don't think you would find other people who would be saying when they think of, well, what's the sort of pivotal point within the macro systems of East Asia in the 20th century earlier, that Haido would not be close to the top of the list. It's simply that it happened to be a phosphate mine. Certainly, the predominant narrative in China is that the 20th century is, a time of immense disruption, of internal violence and of external domination by imperial powers interested in trying to control the China coast and its trade. That's the story, and that therefore a Chinese nationalist account of this sees this as being a story by which the Chinese population and the Chinese state are humiliated by external forces, and as a result of political action undertaken by revolutionaries and then an economic development program sponsored by the state, a sense of self-determination and of political and economic self-control, I guess you'd call it, self-rule, is accomplished basically in the end of the 1990s, really. So this is sort of the story as it happened. So it's an interesting case whereby if you look in the long term, you can say, well, this is part of an enormously powerful and highly developed part of the global economic order from the 13th century and even earlier. That's the long-term view. The shorter-term view is that this zone runs into difficulties economically and politically in the 18th to 19th centuries, and then is recovering its former centrality, if you like, in the course of the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
You're listening to Air to Asia from Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. And just a reminder to listeners about Asia Institute's online publication on Asia and its societies, politics, and cultures. It's called the Melbourne Asia Review. It's free to read and it's open access at melbourneasiareview.edu.au. You'll find articles by some of our regular Air to Asia guests and by many others. Plus, you can catch recent episodes of Air to Asia at the Melbourne Asia Review website, which again you can find at melbourneasiareview.edu.au. I'm Sammy Shah, and I'm joined by Asia historian Dr. Lewis Mayo. We're talking about the tapestry of human connections across the Pacific Ocean. Looking across the Pacific to Bolivia, we see a starkly different outcome. What is the outcome of the loss of the War of the Pacific in 1879 for Bolivia?
So this is a very interesting contrast, because one could argue that look at the question of the middle 20th century, where you see in both the Americas, in Latin America, and in China, revolutionary insurgent movements. The revolutionary Che Guevara, of course, is killed in Bolivia in the end of the 1960s. You see an insurgency that in both places is saying, well, we need radical social and economic transformation, particularly the replacement of the local economic and social power structures. That is found in both sides of the Pacific, essentially in the middle of the 20th century. But the insurgencies in China are successfully able to establish a socialist state which is still in existence, and in the Americas they are almost all defeated, with the exception of that in Cuba, which is the only place where an insurgent state is able to produce a government that has lasted from the 1950s right up until the present. And so what's an interesting contrast there, of course, is that you might say that the life of the average peasant in Bolivia in, say, the 1920s or 1930s is probably roughly similar to, or even slightly ahead of, the life of the average peasant in the Chinese cultural zone in the same period. By the time you get to the end of the 20th century, the economic and political profiles of the two different zones is quite radically different. Bolivia is a small, relatively powerless, landlocked republic in Latin America, and China is a superpower in the present. So those two zones basically move in different directions for a complex of political reasons that are both local and, in a sense, international.
For Bolivia, a change of this magnitude would surely have some effect on the national psyche.
Well, in both Bolivia and in China, as I see it, and I know a great deal more about China than I do about Bolivia. I've lived in China. The narrative of national humiliation through defeat in war is very, very powerful in the shaping of a sense of national culture and of patriotism in both countries. So the humiliations of imperial annexation of Chinese territory, continue to fuel the state nationalism of the People's Republic of China. Bolivia has its own story about national humiliation and the loss of territory, except that the actors in that process are neighboring republics. Well, most significantly, the Republic of Chile, and so this is a different story from the one that is told in China, but they have certain structural similarities. So the lost territory of Taiwan, it might be said, assumes the sort of role in the imagination, the national psyche of the People's Republic of China that the loss of the Pacific coast does in the national psyche of Bolivia.
You've written that the tragedy of the extraction industry is perhaps most visible in Banaba, an island in present day Kiribati. Please give us a potted account of what happened there.
So, as the world, and particularly societies like Australia and New Zealand, are building modern industrialized agricultural systems in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, one of the things that they want and need is chemical fertilizer. And one of the key sources of chemical fertilizer is places where there are deposits of phosphates or of nitrates that originate in bird colonies that have built up deposits of guano over centuries, and that's the case with the phosphate and nitrates found in the annexed territories of Bolivia in Latin America, but also much, much more the case in Pacific Island societies, which became the focus of phosphate mining activities in the course of the late 19th to early 20th centuries. And the need of societies like Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia for these chemical fertilizers, combined with the political domination of initially the British over these societies, meant that essentially they were mined and ecologically devastated by corporations associated essentially with the British imperial system. But because all modern systems of agricultural mass production is a strange word to use for agriculture, but in a sense, industrial production of food require chemical fertilizers. There is intense competition for access to those locations wherever they are in the world, something that persists right up until the present. And the Banaban population is essentially forced to move from its homeland and is relocated in an area that is now a part of Fiji. And this is a matter of enormous pain for the people associated with that story. And I should mention here the very important position of Professor Katerina Te Aiwa and her late sister Teresia Te Aiwa, both Banaban background academics working Katerina Te Aiwa works at the Australian National University, and Teresia Te Aiwa taught at the Victoria University Te Herenga Waka in Wellington in New Zealand. So the consequences of this uh, displacement and environmental destruction are something that is very, very powerfully registered by people who are associated with those communities.
Is it fair then to say that the destruction of Banaba serves as a representation of the wider, often obliterating force of industrial power on societies that have little capacity to resist it?
Yeah, I think whenever you get a desire for a location, whether it's to be used for mining, for some sort of extractive purposes, or whether it's going to be used for the testing of nuclear weapons, the capacities of people within those societies who have autonomous cultural systems that have been built up over thousands of years or hundreds of years is massively reduced. If you're looking at this from the viewpoint of an economic or political super entity, such as the People's Republic of China or the United States, or arguably even Australia or New Zealand or France, these things are just collateral damage because the populations involved are, numerically so small, and they are therefore powerless, in the global system. But for the communities themselves, these structures, external structures, are you know enormous in the impact that they have on local lifeways. And as we know from the questions of climate change leading to sea level rises, which affects Banaba and all of the other islands in Kiribati, and threatens those places essentially with destruction, even though those societies are, small and relatively powerless. The sense of their capacity to speak for the planet is very, very strong, and so they remain amongst the most important actors in the global struggle against climate change.
In your writings, you've pointed out a fascinating, if grim, historical intersection during World War II. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is interesting as I see this zone, right? The 19th century produces this new system across the Pacific and across the world, which is the system essentially of industrial production. For an industrial production system to operate, essentially there need to be global resource transmission chains, but there also needs to be food produced cheaply for industrial workforces. And so that is any power that is seeking to build an industrial base for its military and economic life needs to be able to feed its populations. And this is often meant needing to have access to chemical fertilizers in particular. So countries like Aotearoa New Zealand and Australia, and to an extent the pastoral countries in Latin America, become in the course of the 19th century sources of food production for the industrial world in Britain, and for Britain's global dominance over the economic and political life of the planet in the period up until World War II. But there is another center of that expansion in Japan. And so I mentioned earlier that the need for phosphate fertilizers for food production in Australia and New Zealand is such that the British and Britain's allies use their power essentially to just take those resources from Banaba and Nauru and other places in the Central Pacific. In World War II, what happens is that the extractive entity switches to being Japan, and Japan becomes the entity that is able to take those fertilizer phosphate resources from that zone. So there's a very sharp and violent displacement of the British, Australian, New Zealand phosphate extraction system in Banaba and elsewhere in the Central Pacific when Japan takes control of those zones in the 1940s and essentially rules them until really only a very short period of time. The Americans come in and displace the Japanese at the end of 1943. But this is nonetheless one of those cases whereby global forces and global competition for power, Pacific-wide competition for power between the Americas and East Asia, in that case represented by Japan, converge essentially in the Pacific. And Banaba is in a sense like a kind of almost microcosm of those larger forces.
So you've got now Haijo and Banaba linked with this kind of gunpowder empire logic of the 20th century.
And so that's true. I mean, it's interesting that, in fact, the Japanese, of course, are in control of Haizo and that area after their attack on China in the 1930s. And when they're in control of Banaba, literally, those structures are all part of a Japanese imperial system, which is, based on industrial food production. It's based on modern systems of weaponry. And what's interesting about that, of course, is that even though, the 19th century shift from in a sense, a global economy dominated by agriculture to a global economy dominated by industrial production, that marks a break, essentially, in human historical development. In fact, if one looks at, well, where does gunpowder come from? Where does modern manufacturing come from? It's actually in the zone that Haizo is a part of on the coast of China, essentially running back to the 13th century. So even though we'd say, okay, so, well, 1942 or 1943 looks as though this, which establishes this connection essentially between, Banaba, literal connection between Banaba and the coast of China as a result of, the very swift expansion of the Japanese Empire. In fact, it's building on a foundation that runs back to the emergence, essentially, of the modern system of gunpowder warfare and modern industrial production in the form of porcelain that is unfolding, essentially, between the 1200s and the 1300s, and perhaps to some extent dates back to the 1100s. So this is, something I think that when you put all of the pieces of the puzzle together, you can see, okay, well, this is a long-term history that we can see the consequences of with things like environmental destruction and climate change in the present, but an argument I think can be made that's quite sustainable, that it actually is not new. It's essentially building on something that runs back really to the 13th century period that I spoke about at the beginning of the talk.
So, can we then look at the legacy of those industrial systems that were created in, for example, the 19th and 20th century? I mean, I know you're saying that they go further back, but the history of phosphate mines, what does that tell us about the impact it'll have on places like the Republic of Kiribati?
Industrialization and mining have completely restructured the world in the course of the last few centuries, but particularly the last 100 to 150 years, because particularly once we move to reliance on fossil fuels for transportation and for production, we immediately transform the relationships that humans have to the natural world, because we're essentially using a resource that is procured through extraction by digging, if you like, rather than by growing. And I think that, we are now living in this age of, major transition when those mining structures and those extraction structures are continuing to operate, but with the climate change crisis that we now acknowledge that we're experiencing, it's likely that those areas that may have had a point of prominence as a result of their importance to an older system of, in a sense, mining or extraction-based industrial production, as that is shifting, what we may be starting to see is perhaps a return to an older system in which local economies and local ecosystems were really self-sustaining. So if you think about it, the Bunabun system prior to the expansion of the global industrial economy is at least in terms of the production of food and of shelter, almost entirely local. Now, that's never going to come back. We're going to have an interacting global structure. Its globality, its globalness, if you like, is in a sense set in stone. There's no stepping away from that. But in critical areas, I think the catastrophic consequences of the resource extraction economy has meant that, in a sense, in critical areas, the production of energy, being one of the most important of those, it's going to be the locality that acquires perhaps a level of importance that it perhaps last had before we saw industrial expansion happen in the way that it did in the last 150 years.
A fascinating look then at the connections between all of us created through the Pacific. Our guest has been Asia historian Dr. Louis Mayo from Asia Institute. Thank you, Louis.
Thanks, Sammy.
Air to Asia is brought to you by Asia Institute of the University of Melbourne, Australia. You can find more information about this and all our other episodes at the Asia Institute website. Be sure to keep up with every episode of Air to Asia by following us on the Apple Podcasts app, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please rate and review it. Every positive review helps new listeners find the show. And please help us by spreading the word on your socials. This episode was recorded on the 29th of June 2026. Producers were Eric Van Bemmel and Kelvin Param of Profactual.com. Air to Asia is licensed under Creative Commons, copyright 2026, the University of Melbourne. I'm Sammy Shah. Thanks for your company.